So often times when people think about or talk about trauma, what often comes to mind is like, oh, anything that's negative, right? And that can lead to kind of two extremes, right? One can be to really minimize and say, hey, everybody has negative things, right? Everyone's traumatized in some way, and then that can lead people to sort of discount it, right? On the other end, if we're painting with too much of a broad brush, there are people who then want to say, every child gets a trophy, or we want to start then protecting people from any adversity, right? So trauma is not anything with clinical trauma, right? It's not anything that's negative, right? It is something that is negative in a way that overwhelms our coping skills, right? Mm-hmm. So if it overwhelms our ability to take it in, our ability to cope with what that trauma is, then there are changes in our brains. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's not just like, oh, it's anything negative. No, it's something that rises to the level where our brain function, right, and therefore our psychology, right, which rides upon our brain function, is different going forward. And there's hard scientific evidence about this. So it's not a soft concept, right? Like we know that, for example, vigilance mechanisms in the brain change right after trauma, the true trauma that overwhelms our coping mechanisms and leaves us different going forward, that all sorts of things shift inside of us, including genetic changes where it can change how active or not active our genes are when we pass them on years later. Wow. Right. So if you think about that, it's grounded in the cutting edge of science, but we are not applying that cutting edge of science in our understanding of like what's going on in the world around us, in our societies, and what's going on in each of us.
So you're saying that so you can have two people experience the same thing, trauma, same adversity, and one registers as an actual trauma and one doesn't, correct?
Right. Right. And even in the same person, there's something called, say, the multiple hit hypothesis, which might say that I might have 3, 4, 5 traumas, maybe, right? And they could look pretty significant from the outside, but they don't overwhelm my coping mechanisms and change my brain as I go forward. Then there might be another one that might even be much smaller, say less than the magnitude of the previous ones. And that could push a person into now having basically a post-trauma syndrome. So it varies by person. What are our genetics? And are our genetics protective, or do they make liability for us? What has our prior life experience been? What support mechanisms do we have around us? Mm-hmm. So it varies across people, and it can also vary within a person where it might be that 4th, 5th, 6th trauma that can then make a syndrome that didn't occur with the first.
Wow. How, just to give more insight, like given maybe an anecdotal situation of something that would be perceived to anyone as small, like how small can something get for the body to register it as a trauma?
Well, I mean, theoretically, it could get quite small, very small, if the person is particularly susceptible, right? So if you imagine someone who's been in just dire circumstances, right, and they've gotten through them without being overwhelmed. Say the person is made it through being a refugee and trying to escape Syria and get from one place to another, and just makes it through, and then gets to a place where seemingly they feel like, okay, now I'm safe, right? I'm out of the danger, right? And then imagine in environments like that, if there's some sort of chronic denigration where the person is now seen as less than, they're ethnically different or their socioeconomic status is different, that could push someone to then a post-trauma syndrome, even though one might think there's nothing even dramatic going on
happening anymore.
Right. Right. But so much of what goes on with us, like it all goes on inside of us, right? And then we have to live with the experiences that happen inside of us and how they impact us, which is why we need a healthcare system that's actually paying attention to what's going on inside of us, talking to us about it, right? As opposed to seeing all of us the same. I mean, I think, the what we've been talking about so far is like really important, right? Because it's acknowledging the difference across human beings, that, hey, we're not all the same, right? We don't have the same genetic makeup. We don't have the same experiences. We don't react the same way. And if we look at us all the same, right? How are we going to help any of us? And that's also, in writing a book that I wish to be accessible to anyone, right, who chooses to pick it up and read it, and entertaining and engaging, that writes about these things in sort of common, plain language, right? It's so that we can gain an understanding, not just of what it is, but of how do we prevent it? I mean, that's ultimately what we wish to do. Or how do we recognize it if it's present? How do we treat it? Because the systems around us, the medical systems and mental health care systems, are doing such a poor job of that.
What are kind of the environmental circumstances that lead to someone, since obviously everyone registers things different, and even that person individually themselves can register it different over time or through repetition? What is it that that makes your nervous system able to cope better? What are some skills that would allow you to cope better with things so that things don't register as a trauma? Is that even possible?
Yeah, sure. Anything that can put us in lower states of vulnerability, right? So if you think, how many people are going through life, even before the pandemic, right, in a state of fairly constant vulnerability, right? I remember reading before the pandemic all this great news about how the unemployment rate is so low, right? But then you would also see news that would say some really astronomical percentage of people, right, can't survive and move forward as they're living if they have like a $500 or $600 expense, right? And then you think, okay, we're sort of celebrating that there's a low unemployment rate, but so many people are employed in sectors where they just can't get ahead. Right. I mean, you think about the service industry and like how hard it is, maybe even approaching impossible to like do things people could do in the past, right? To buy a home, send children to college if they choose, right? That as all of that changes, that what ends up happening is it builds vulnerability into the system, where now people's medical benefits are tied to a job that they could lose, right? Or they have a job, but their job doesn't have medical benefits, and you need a job to have medical benefits, or at least you have historically, right? In this country, we're doing somewhat of a better job at that now. But these states of vulnerability, which can also come by feeling denigrated in any way, whether that's because of socioeconomic status or it's around gender or sexuality, right? There's so many ways in which people are sort of chronically denigrated, right? And feel a sense of being less than, and like that really doesn't help at all with our resilience mechanisms when something traumatic happens. And the more we're interconnected with other people, there's friends and family and support networks around us, things that we had a lot more in the past that we now have a lot less of. So absolutely, we can do things to predispose us to handle traumatic things well, so that they don't leave us different going forward, right? But unfortunately, a lot of what's happened in the world around us only brings more vulnerability and predisposes us to the negative reactions inside of us through traumatic things. And how many people have lost their lives, right? So how many people are now trying to go forward with lost loved ones and feeling a sense of vulnerability they never felt before. And we have such an angry and often heartless political dialogue around us that can we blame anyone if most people are feeling beleaguered? And then what are we doing? We're just making soil that's fertile for the seeds of trauma to fall, whether that's a car accident or it's a death of a loved one or it's loss of a job or it's any of the other millions of things that can happen to us. We create fertile ground for the seeds of trauma to change our brains, to release shame, to create fear in us, and to make life worse for us going forward. And I don't think that's esoteric. I mean, I think that's the common sense read of what's going on around us. I mean, I'm trying to put some structure to it in the book and in this conversation, but I also think that it's just eminently obvious just looking at the world around us.
What a great perspective. The word that comes to mind the whole time is sovereignty. And how I feel like we're all being called into sovereignty over our bodies, over our minds, and that there's so much being pushed on us that it's like it kind of is at a breaking point. or we're being pushed so hard that we need to step into that. Does that register? Is that the right way of thinking about it?
Yeah. I mean, most people are pushed really hard after these last couple of years, right? And most people were pushed really hard before these last couple of years. I mean, you need look no further than the opiate epidemic and how many thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people died needlessly. Right. And how much of that was desperation when, the opiates after the surgery, didn't just help the knee pain, right? But they helped a greater kind of pain, right? A kind of pain inside that then created a dependence that ended up killing that person. And as someone who's done a lot of work in that realm over years and years, it's just tragic because it's the opiate epidemic. Yes, it was a symptom of many, many things. But one of the things it was a symptom of was the desperation that's getting built into all of us, right? It's getting built into us as Americans, and we're not doing a good job of taking care of ourselves. Resources are squandered, right? We don't look around us for how can we use our resources as a society better? How can we use healthcare resources to actually treat our health? I mean, you look at what's going on and you say, in a way, it's exactly what one would expect, right? If we all live together on a street and we said, well, let's not take care of it anymore, right? Let's have potholes in the street, and who cares if the tree limbs fall off and kill somebody? And we'll fight with each other too while we're doing it, right? Are we really going to be surprised if we run that forward and we're like, wow, some of us are dead, right? A lot of us are really at risk or unhappy. We're at odds. And this street that might have been a lovely place to live before is now going downhill. And it's not for lack of resources, right? It's just that the resources are squandered, or we're just looking at everything through a lens of anger and frustration. And there's so much of that in the world where you think about the idea of the lack of attachment to truth and to fact, right? Which is, as a guy who was a political science major and followed politics for so many years, at least people would agree if there was a fact. If I were saying 1 + 1 is 3 and you're saying it's 2, and you can show me that it's 2, right? I think in the past I was unlikely to double down and say, you know what, it's 3 anyway, right? And now I'll attack you personally, right? I mean, why? When we do that, we work so strongly against our own interests, and so much of that comes because people are just angry. And this is how it gets. If we're afraid and we're angry, we just want to be right.